Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for this now 8th installment of our monthly webinar series in 2022. My name is Daniel Hodges. I am president and co-founder of Pieces of Me Foundation. And for those of you who are new to our community or just learning about us, we have been around for a couple of years now. We are disability led with a variety of different experiences and perspectives. And as you will learn tonight, that plays an integral part as far as what we do and who we are. And we started doing these webinars earlier this year with the purpose of broadening and redefining the conversation around disability, hoping to create better understanding, because that's the best way that we're going to get rid of the stigma. So I want to welcome all of you tonight, and we will get to our program here in a moment, but I want to start off by letting our team introduce themselves and kind of share a little about why they're here and what they are hoping to see tonight. And we're going to take it from there. So Christy, you're over there monitoring the chat and letting people in. Would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Christy Rogers, as Dan mentioned. I am also working on the technical stuff of this production tonight. I am the vice president and co-founder of Pieces of Me. I initially started this with Dan because my youngest daughter was born missing half of her right arm, and it was very important to me to make sure that everyone else out there, no matter what they're dealing with, a disability, a physical difference, a mental illness, just it's important that everyone has access to the resources that are available to them and knows what is out there and also has support. So that became my biggest passion after having my daughter, was bringing awareness and just kind of spreading the word and promoting inclusion. So I wanted to take that to a higher level, and that's why we started Pieces of Me. And then later on, I actually developed an invisible disability myself. So that kind of tied into, kind of advocating for invisible illnesses as well. So that's kind of my story in a nutshell. And I thank everyone for being here tonight for this wonderful discussion that we are about to have.
All right, thank you. Karen, let's go to you next if you're able to introduce yourself.
Thank you. Yes, I'm using my husband's computer, so I don't know how to get to his camera. I'll figure that out. But hello, I'm Karen Schultz, and my day job, I am the director of the Disability Access Services Office at the University of Baltimore. That is actually how I got connected with Daniel. And silly me, talked to him about wanting to do community kind of work a few years ago, and he was still in school, and he said, well, and talked about pieces. So here I am. I have been in the disability field in higher ed for nearly 30 years and been at the university in this position for close to 16. So I've done a lot of work with that. And I also, as the others have shared, I live with invisible disabilities. Mine are depression, anxiety, and recently something that's considered somewhat rare, I have something called pulsatile tinnitus. And that is a constant, not ringing, but pulsation in my ear, regardless of heart condition or anything else. And it is 24/7. At this point, we don't know what's causing it, and nor do we know if there's anything we can do about it. But it's quite frustrating to sit. I don't get any quiet. Everyone wants to sit in a space and get peace and quiet. I get peace, but no quiet. So I'm learning to work through that as well. And that's probably all I need to share. And thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you. Fred, why don't we turn to you next?
Fred, you're muted if you're there.
Sorry, I've been muted the whole time. Let me restate everything I just said.
I thought that might have been
All
nice.
right, yeah. So my name is Fred Brown. In my day job, I'm a law professor at the University of Baltimore School of Law. And in fact, that's how I met Daniel. So Daniel was a student in my business organizations class. He was a joy to have in class, an excellent student. At that time, we actually started talking about Pieces of Me. I don't think it was actually formed yet. I think it was in the process of being formed. And we had some conversations about it. And I don't know, maybe about a year after that, Daniel asked me to join the board. And I was happy to do so. I'm still very happy to be on the board. Disability is the whole sort of area of disability is new for me. I have really no prior experiences in this area. But I do have quite a bit of experience in working on the boards of nonprofits. So I am, trying to do the best I can to help, serve the very important mission of Pieces of Me.
Well, thank you. Tiffany, if you're able to come off mute, we'll turn to you next.
Just popped on and off, but looks back on again. Tiffany, if you're there, you're muted too.
While Tiffany figures out the technical stuff, Deborah, you're the last one as the newest member of the team, so I will let you go, and we'll turn back to Tiffany in a minute if she's able.
Sounds great. Hi, I'm Deborah. As you can hear, I just recently joined the board here, so I'm very happy and thrilled for this opportunity. I love this term, day job. So for my day job, besides being a mom to 2 teenagers, I'm also a patient advocate, and I'm working with Union Health as well, with the myasthenia gravis group for contributor, as well as a moderator, as well as working in several other areas, including mindfulness practice. I'm doing mindfulness facilitation with a focus on helping people with chronic illnesses practice that mindfulness moment and programs that can help us along the way. I also have a background in education and law. I didn't quite finish that law degree, 5 years away, still working on that somehow, hopefully one day. But I have been working in the disability arena for over 30 plus years. And I began my advocacy in my first week in college, when I first had that label of disabled put upon me, and learning how to create more accessible places on campus for the student body. So with that, I'm very happy to be here. I think these conversations are essential. The more we communicate, the more we talk, the more we share our experiences and experiences with others, the more we create that dialogue that helps bring our communities together. So with that, Daniel, thank you so much. And I pass the mic back to you.
Excellent, and thank you. And we came to the realization that we've had a lot of really intriguing topics so far this year. But as I've been working in the advocacy arena, and I know as others as well, we sometimes are reminded that some of the basics about etiquette, language, all of those sorts of things are not generally understood, or can sometimes even be received as conflicting messages. So what we wanted to do was kind of go back to square one. And for those who are new to this topic, provide an approachable on-ramp that can maybe demystify the topic and be a welcoming place where you can, feel like you're getting your footing. And for those who have been experienced and been around the block a time or 20, maybe a refresher to learn from one another, because sometimes how things are expressed within different groups under that disability category can vary. And then also to hear from people who are trying to figure out how to be an ally and are at square one. I find that to be really educational myself, and I hope that others will find that that is the case for them as well. So with that in mind, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are a group of people with a variety of different experiences, beliefs, backgrounds, you name it. And in that, we don't agree on everything, including some of the verbiage that some of us prefer. And that's not an accident. It's because we want to strengthen one another, increase that empathy, and maybe help create more of a broader understanding. So with that in mind, you're probably going to hear even members on our team tonight disagree with one another, and you are certainly free to disagree with us, any of us, all of us as well. Our simple request is that if you disagree, if you don't know, if you feel like this is being thrown into the deep end, all of that is not only acceptable, it is expected. Our ask is that each of us leads with empathy and respect and a willingness to learn from one another. Because if we get those three things right, the words will eventually work themselves out. So with that in mind, I am going to turn it back to some of our board members to start off with, to kind of model this conversation. And Deborah, you and I had an interesting back and forth a little after we wrote the copy for this about suffering and inspirational, and you made a really great comment. So I'm wondering if you would maybe share that again and expound upon that as a way to break the ice.
Sure, of course. Cognitively, I might not remember exactly what I wrote, but that's okay. I was really explaining, to explain, to give everybody an idea here, I have both visible and invisible disabilities. I do use a wheelchair. I do have full leg braces, back brace, neck brace, and I have oxygen and a silver stock. So you can see that I have visible challenges, but most of my disabilities or limitations come from the severe chronic pain, the severe muscular weakness from my autoimmune conditions and minor muscular disorders, as well as my Ehlers-Danlos. I have people come up to me at the strangest of times telling me how brave I am, how amazing I am. And it's just because I'm out of my house or I'm out of the room on a cruise ship taking, I was on a cruise ship taking photos. And I had someone every time she saw me telling me that. Now that kind of was frustrating because I wasn't brave for leaving my room. No, there was a thunderstorm. I can get that, would be a little bit brave. But it wasn't anything major that day. It was just a beautiful day, beautiful activities. So in my mind, if someone wants to call me brave and inspiring, I want it to be for what I do, not because I've left my house or I've gotten dressed for the day or I'm in front of the camera. Although, okay, I'll take back it. Being in front of the camera is a big thing for me. So pedaling back, that one's a brave one for me. But that concept, if someone finds me inspiring, phenomenal. If they find my speech inspiring or the work that I do, the service that I do, oh, I love that. That is like my golden butter, so to speak. I mean, last night I was at a Boy Scout meeting and we were teaching about diversity and about inclusion. And the fact that some of the leaders and the youth leaders found that inspiring, awesome. But just because I've left my house or I've gotten dressed or on the occasion I actually get all done up and wearing a dress, that part, I don't want to be inspiring for that. I want to be inspiring for what I accomplish, what I teach, what I express. And quite frankly, I've had so many achievements this year personally in terms of my own self image and being able to reflect and appreciate where I'm at in my life at this point in time. So I'm inspired by that. And if somebody else is inspired by that, kudos, awesome, great. Just, it shouldn't be, if I want to be considered inspiring, I want to be inspiring for what I've accomplished, what I've taught, or the message that I've helped create, or even just the concept of having the wheels turn and you think of something different. So I can't remember exactly what I said, Daniel, but I think that's along the lines.
Oh, that's great. And to follow up on that, I know for me, it's been a struggle because sometimes that threshold for being inspiring is, oh, you put on your shoes or you left your house. And then when that becomes the backdrop or something you're almost shielding yourself from, it becomes difficult to accept a genuine compliment based off of what one might call a real accomplishment or an accomplishment that would otherwise earn praise. Deb, is that something you would empathize with and maybe elaborate on?
Absolutely. And too, right, that has to do with our individual journeys, because I've had a very big challenge accepting compliments up until recently. I'm learning to accept them now, but it's taken me a really long time. And even with that, with the putting the shoes on, I was taking my medicine. I almost like spit out the water that I was drinking, just because that resonates so much with me. And again, this is where if somebody understands my journey and know how much pain a day might be for me, and knowing that if I was getting my shoes on, to them that could be inspiring if I was able to get up out of bed and get dressed and everything. But to the average person who doesn't know my story, it's almost a belittling, right? It's this low expectation. And because that expectation is so low, often when we're achieving something, it can be harder to accept that compliment because we've already been like, the way I want to look at it is people, quite frankly, the more disabled you appear, have somehow correlated that with how inspiring, how effective, how our brains might work, how that might interact with each other, right? And I don't know why, but there's that correlation with it. But for me, I would say yes. It took me a really long time to accept. I'm almost 40. I'm 47. It's only took me to maybe about 4 months ago before I can finally accept compliments and value what I've accomplished. So that's, I think giving you an idea there, because I've done a lot in my life, but that downgraded expectation definitely, I feel, impacts us in terms of our self-confidence, because we have so many people not expecting success. And that was something I also faced in education. Quite frankly, my master's and my law degree program, I was told I wouldn't graduate because of my disabilities. And when they became problems, I was told, I told you this would happen type of a response. So that expectation was so low that it's sometimes hard to have higher expectations for yourself when the world is telling you you can't do something, instead of people just asking. And that's what I tell kids all the time. Ask how we're doing, ask what we're doing, and go from that perspective versus this overall decision of what is successful or not successful for somebody with a disability. Because quite frankly, and I tell this to kids too, if you have low expectations for somebody and they don't quite meet that, they're going to be at a lower level, right? If you have really high expectations and they get close to that, then we are going to be much more successful. So having these higher expectations and belief in people, I think, is invaluable in terms of our own self-development.
Thank you so much. And I'll take you off the hot seat and let you get your drink of water, at least for a minute. Christy, we've had a number of fascinating discussions. One that stands out to me is the fact that you identify as someone with an invisible disability, but as you mentioned in your intro, your daughter has a limb difference, and you, and I'll say this with love and understanding, you are rather emphatic about not classifying your daughter as someone with a disability. So I would love if you could, elaborate on that and kind of just share your thoughts there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the difference for me and the reason why it's different for me versus her is because for those of you who don't know me, which is a lot of you, my invisible disability is severe damage to my spine, all the way from my neck down to my lower back. And it causes a lot of issues and obstacles for me. And it has drastically changed my life. My daughter, on the other hand, she was born missing her right hand and forearm. So as she grew and learned new things, just normal daily tasks that most of us do, she didn't know any different. So for her, I like to think of her as differently abled because she is very much able to do anything. Nothing holds her back. She adapts based on her difference, and there's nothing that she hasn't been able to accomplish when she tries it. And for me, I think that that's kind of just a word that I don't want her perceiving herself as at such a young age. Since she's only 5 years old, we've made it kind of our mission to make sure that she knows she is just as capable. She might have to use an adaptive device to help her, or she might not even need that. She might just do it a little bit different than someone who, say, has 2 hands would. But she is just amazing to watch, and she adapts to any situation that she is put in.
Now, see, because I started this thing with you and because I'm your cousin, I get to be the first one to say, I respect your opinion and I respect and acknowledge your experience and what you're trying to accomplish. And I certainly agree that we can't argue with one of those experiences, and we certainly shouldn't demean what one another is trying to accomplish. That being said, I personally, when I hear differently abled, I think ick. And here's why. It takes the emphasis off of the fact that the world was designed intentionally for a certain subset of the population, and that even if our capabilities are quite similar, it is the structural, makes the structural and societal barriers, kind of go into the shadows where they should be acknowledged and dealt with. And the other thing I personally struggle with differently abled is that it almost feels to me like I have to be extra smart or extra funny or extra whatever in order to compensate for my blindness, and heaven forbid I try to compensate for the Ehlers-Danlos on top of it. Whereas to me, all of those are just characteristics, none better than the other. But again, that's my perspective, so I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah, I know, and I definitely understand that perspective as well. And I did see the message in the chat from Sandy. I definitely don't perceive the word or any part of being disabled negative. I think it's just, I think it's just for me being her mom, I see things differently with her. So, and either way, no matter what word a person prefers or how they classify themselves. I think that that's great. I just, for what, from my perspective, and just after talking to like even professionals, even her pediatrician has stated she doesn't think of that as a disability. So I guess it's just kind of, the background from where we started when she was born and all those interactions that we've had with different medical professionals and all the different perspectives we've seen along the way.
Deborah, it looks like you had your hand up.
Yeah, yes. And I did want to say, Christy, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I guess for me, and I hear you fully, I have to say, I didn't have a label disabled placed upon me until college orientation. Despite the fact that I had been on crutches from age 13 on when I destroyed my knees in track and field, and I had not yet been diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos or diagnosed with RSD, CRPS, which is chronic regional pain syndrome. And I had gone through a significant amount of bullying and exclusion and all that other things. But I hadn't had that title or that label placed upon me. So when it was placed upon me at college orientation, I had such a negative view of the word disabled, because in my mind, it meant I was lesser than. Still get emotional because the whole day was a very emotional experience. But and I ended up using power scooter 3 days before college when I got my first power scooter. And where I was going with this is, it doesn't matter what terminology we use with our children, as long as we empower them, this is my personal opinion, but as long as we're really teaching that empowerment of self-love and compassion and striving to be the best that we could be, I think that's really important. Personally, I don't like the word differently able because I do feel, for me personally, it reduces the accommodations that I might need, right? And so for me, differently able just means we all have different abilities, right? We all need different things. My kids have ADHD and one has oppositional defiance disorder, so they need accommodation. So when I hear differently abled, I'm thinking people just have different abilities versus disabled, where somebody needs an accommodation to be able to be successful and be able to live their best life. Those are different things that come to my mind. And I know I'm sure you are teaching your daughter pride in herself, and as you already said, how much pride you have in her for what she's doing at age 5 and what she's able to do. So I think, it's about that communication, about that pride, about that empowerment. And I know there's an open mic, but I did wanted to say that element because it can be scary when we have that term or that label placed upon us, and that can be a very scary experience. Both with this differently abled or disabled, it can be a scary experience when you have that label because it's real now, so to speak. So I just wanted to throw that out there too.
Karen, we've had some educational stuff brought in, and you've been working in this field for a long time. So I'd love to hear your take on this.
Thank you. I think I understand everyone's perspective, and I try my best, of course, to hear it and listen out. I think going to the concept of the inspiration that Deborah brought up, I totally agree with that. Because I really think when someone tells me, oh, wow, you did this, let me step back. We have people on campus who know they have students with disabilities in their classes or staff to interact with them. And I inevitably hear at least once a semester, if not more often, wow, it's amazing that students with disabilities are in this program or taking courses here, et cetera. How inspiring is that? And I was like, you know what? No. Because they've made the cut, they've met the criteria to be accepted into a selected admissions university. So it may have had to take more time, more effort, more ways of doing it than other people without diagnoses like that impact them. But one, they're here because they are supposed to be here. The inspiration part, I try and have people understand that, well, I can't tell you not to be inspired. Well, I can tell you, instead of feeling inspired, be inspired to act. So don't just sit back in the emotional feeling about it. Understand that. And Danny, we talked about this in the phrase that I started using. Ableism, which I'm sure we'll get into, is running rampant. But people need to understand that someone does something someone with a disability does ABC, and we usually say despite the disability. What I want to say now is despite ableism. Because what we're trying to tell people is your disability should not define who you are from how we look at people, but it should hopefully help people understand that how you do something means that's how you do it. The same thing as my husband has undiagnosed ADHD. He's not in the room. He doesn't have to hear this. But how he approaches something of the same task, like cooking, is night and day different than how I do it. But we both can cook the same recipe. Does that mean he does it from a different point? It's just how we do something. And for Daniel, how he accesses content has to be through a screen reader. How I access content, I have the visual capability to read a book without having to use a screen reader. We're both reading, we're both learning the content, but we are not doing it the same way. So I think we need to look at how we approach the ableistic world and frame it from that the person is still doing it. Let's figure out how we don't have to accommodate, because then we're all doing it our way, but we don't have to have an accommodation to support it. It's an ongoing conversation. I think what people in the chat have put in, the medical model is absolutely a deficit model. Doctors are taught to fix things, to cure people. And when they're diagnosed, I mean, they're looking at them from that angle. The other piece that I'm going to refer to is what Danny and I've talked about is understanding how, and of course, my whole world is about providing access through accommodations, is providing understanding that when I ask someone in a classroom, a faculty, to do something, it's not necessarily just for the student who's identified having a disability. It also helps this other students access the content as well, maybe just more of an access concern. So that's probably one of the reasons why Daniel got me hooked into Pieces, because this has been an ongoing conversation, a passion of mine to really help others see that a person who has a disability, or as we're talking about, identifies as having a disability, or a person who wants to say, I'm a disabled person. I'm not going to judge which way you refer to yourself. When they do what they do, they're doing what they do. And it's despite our beliefs otherwise of what they maybe not be able to do because of the disability. A case in point here is, even though I love watching the Paralympics because I'm not an athlete, so to me, the Olympics are cool because I'm not athletic. But the fact that we have to have separate times when this happens means that we're not giving them equal playing, equal attention, but they're still performing the same skills of doing the actual, I'm losing my mind, my thought process of the sport. So we have archery, we have skiing, we have basketball, we have water tennis, we have all those sports that everyone does in both the able-bodied and the Paralympics. But why can't they have all those Olympians there at the same time and just have the competition? They don't get the same coverage. They don't get the same glorification that they've won medals. That, to me, is also a part of how the community at large looks at us. That, okay, that's cool. I'm inspired. Wow, look at that. It's like, no, I'm inspired because I can't do that and I'm able-bodied. So I give you credit because I tried. So that's... Again, I get tongue-tied because this gets to be something I just have to run on with. It's wording. It comes down to respect. And asking the person you're interacting with, how do you identify? And we've talked also, Daniel, about identities and the cross intersectionality of identities. Do I identify as someone with a disability? Not in every avenue I'm in. I identify as a mom. I identify as a female. I identify as this. So I identify differently depending on the environment. My disabilities are always with me, however, but I don't make that my focal point either.
Well, thank you. And could you, since you brought the word into the conversation, could you give a brief definition of ableism? And then also, I think there's a really great several great comments, but one that just entered the chat. Could you also talk a little about your use of the word able-bodied?
I use that honestly. There's someone in the room right now who has their microphone on. If everyone who's not speaking can mute, so I can hear what I'm saying as I talk to everybody. So I think I use able-bodied more so from a personal perspective, Daniel, because I am not always able-bodied. I literally broke my foot in the courtroom at the university, and it was a flat surface. I'm not quite able-bodied. I think the difference we look at is we look at that from a definition of what people are able to do because they don't need possibly prosthetics, they don't need other supports and services, they're able. Maybe we need to look at and I know we do, terminology, words matter. How we address someone, how we treat someone based on our judgment, and able-bodied becomes a judgment because we're saying you're able-bodied. Now, I think it's capabilities as opposed to ableness. That's why ableness is something we need to get rid of, making decisions based on what we think as opposed to what we know. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Daniel.
I think you did. And, you know, and I'm going to open it up here to everyone to either raise your hand and come off mute or continue to put questions in the chat because this has been great. But before I do that, I'm going to put Fred on the spot for a minute. Sorry, my friend. And I'm going to do that because you do not identify as an individual with a disability. And what you didn't really go into too deep in your intro was that, you know, this was a new topic for you as you came onto the board. You've done a great job learning it. So I was hoping you would share a little about that journey over the last couple of years. And also tonight, as you're hearing these different perspectives on how we you know, perceive words, perceive messages, what's going through your mind as an ally?
Good questions. Well, I have learned a lot over the last few years, you know, just understanding the different challenges that people with disability face. I mean, I probably could reason them out before, but hearing things firsthand and, you know, spending time with you all and also, you know, attending these wonderful webinars. As far as your, so what's going through my mind? Well, I think I shared this with the board a few weeks ago. I mean, you know, I'm try to be, you know, well-meaning and all, but I do have, you know, sometimes even during board meetings, apprehension, making sure I don't say the wrong thing. Still don't have all the terminology down. So I guess that what I would, I'm a big believer in using terminology that is accepted by the people with respect to which, or the people who could maybe be the most offended if you use the wrong terminology. So I'm a big believer in that. So I want to, you know, use the, you know, quote, right terminology. So what's going through my mind is to try to understand what that is. Once I have that down, I will certainly use it. Now, I can understand that even, hearing the sort of debate that you and Christy had, there's obviously disagreement, on what is the more appropriate terminology. And I can see that. But there are some things I think that are probably clearly not correct. It just came, I've done this now for a while, and I know that Daniel's a big baseball fan, but fairly recently, the Major League Baseball, they removed the term disabled list. Now they call it the injured list. I mean, so that was done, as a way, and I just did some research, because there was some pushback from, certain groups advocating for disabled individuals. So, I think that's great. I mean, use terminology that is appropriate and non-offensive. But I think it is helpful for somebody like me just to know what that is.
Fred, first, thank you for giving me the authentic and raw answer that I knew you would. And also, you brought up the topic of, changing the term disabled list to injured list in MLB. And I had noticed that too. And to be honest, it kind of annoyed me back when it was in the old days, but now I didn't give it a ton of thought, but now as it has happened, I think it's important to note that this isn't an ethereal change either. You have players, a handful of them for sure, who have identified as being, say, type 1 diabetics. You have Trey Mancini of now Houston Astros, John Lester of the Chicago Cubs, I guess retired now, and others who have identified and made it known that they are cancer survivors. What some people don't realize is that both of those actually fall under the ADA in a lot of circumstances. That's something that they, wouldn't ordinarily fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And it opens the door for the bigger conversation of, what abilities does one have to have? What characteristics does one have to have in order to be a successful athlete and compete along one's peers? And I think we're learning, and this ties into the conversation we've been having in the chat. We're learning that exceptional athleticism comes in more forms than one originally assumed from a societal perspective.
Thank you, Daniel, for being more succinct than I was.
I don't know about that. It was just a different viewpoint.
But I think part of the conversation needs to also happen, as it's happening in chat, is just the fact that terminology and language is being changed for the better. It does hopefully allow acceptance and then maybe understanding. We're also seeing a lot, and I'm loving this, as much as I don't want to say I want people to have disabilities per se, but we're seeing a lot more professional athletes coming out and talking about mental health issues, and taking breaks, taking care of themselves. And I remember when Simone Biles stepped away from the beam during the Olympics, and I had a conversation with my son, who's also not home, so I can talk about him, who has ADHD, and he is an athlete without question. And he first started saying, she shouldn't do that. She is, an exemplary athlete. And she's expected to perform. I said, she is, but why are you telling me her diagnosis, her mental health diagnosis, doesn't count the same as if she had a physical injury and had to step back? And he had to step back himself and think, okay, I get that. I said the pressure of her going on and trying to do her balance beam, knowing she could easily fall and injure herself severely and never pry again, taking that step back and admitting that was better for her, it's setting a wonderful example for anybody to say, it's about what I need to do for me. And understand that you may not see the diagnosis, you may not understand how it impacts me because you don't live with the diagnosis, you don't live with the impact and the barriers. This is the right thing to do. And at the following of that, after when all the other athletes start to recognize that, to me, that's a change in mindset. It's a paradigm shift. Hopefully it's a wave of people going, that's okay, because you are important and taking care of you is what's important.
Deborah, it looks like you had your hand up again.
Well, Karen just said everything very well. So I don't really have much to add to that. I was going to originally, but I do want to highlight that mindset shift because that applies to all of us, right? And how we view ourselves, see ourselves, and that self-care element. And it's something that I've been working on a great deal in my own self-care. But I love that because that was actually the same, very similar conversation, Karen, that I had with my kids about the mental health being just as much of a limitation as somebody who uses a wheelchair, right? And it can be even more debilitating depending on someone's condition. So I think it's important we have these discussions and understanding how do we approach this discussion about someone's mental health or needing that break and understanding that value of self-care, because quite frankly, if somebody has severe depression or they have anxiety issues and other things like PTSD, for example, it's something you can see, but it can be very debilitating. And that was something I learned first person. I got to witness, in coming of age and working in a disability computer lab, I saw lots of different types of disabilities and lots of people playing sports. For those that don't know, I didn't know there was such thing as blind baseball for people that were blind or other sports for people that were blind. And it was amazing to learn that. So I will say, I found that inspiring because I have enough challenges myself trying to do something. I can't imagine quite doing it the way some of my friends have. But I also, I think it's important that we find and learn the verbiage. And something I'll tell you, Fred, I tell this to people all the time, ask, right? Because I've asked Daniel before too, like, what is the appropriate term for me to use in this situation? Or even to the term versus blind versus visually impaired. I ask now, and some people aren't open about talking, and other people like myself who don't have a problem speaking, as you can all tell, I have a gift of gab. I'm happy to use that as a teachable moment. So I think it's important that we connect with that. And, even back to an inspiring question, as I was talking in the chat, I realized, I'm not a professional athlete by any means, but my recent accomplishment last spring, learning how to re-ski again, learning a new way to ski again, that to me was inspiring, right? And yet people still don't know what to refer to me as because they can see that I can do certain things. They can see I have other limitations. So I tell people, just ask. That's what my opinion is. The worst that somebody can say is they're not feeling up to talking or they don't want to talk about it. The best thing is you might learn a new terminology that works for that person. And it's a great way to break the ice and say, hey, I don't know your story, but can you help me understand better?
If I can continue with Deborah's point, because I totally agree. Asking to me is so important. And there's a couple of ways that I can bring up with someone who is blind or has a visually based disability. And like when Daniel first came to the university, I always offer to do orientation and mobility so they get a feel for the campus. He was like, I'm going to do it by myself. And he did. But I asked because I know that sometimes people don't have someone to do that on their behalf or with them. I don't make the assumption that let's just do it and go do it. I think asking about how someone wants to be identified, it's the same thing as asking a student from another country, how do I pronounce your name? Because you're looking at the individual. And if they want to talk about their diagnosis as part of their identity, you're giving them a chance to teach you how to respect them as that individual. The other thing we talk about when we do these kinds of trainings on campus is we don't codify accommodations based on the diagnosis and say, all right, here's your set of diagnosis because that's your accommodations because that's your diagnosis. We treat the students individually. So I would say if you met a person with ADHD, you've met a person with ADHD because it doesn't mean it's the same way for everybody. The criteria to determine it has to be consistent because that's how we hopefully measure and determine there's a diagnosis. But I am never going to say to them, here's your bucket of accommodations based on your diagnosis alone. And we have had students I'm going to use the law school because it's a really great example. We had students years ago who were deaf and hard of hearing. One relied only on interpreters because that was how they grew up. They were born deaf. They always had ASL as their native language. Another student came in, also lost hearing over time, did have a cochlear implant, which helped, but in some of those big classrooms, it's not a perfect system because of the echoing and other things. But the student also's native language wasn't English, nor was it ASL. It was Arabic. So ASL wasn't a solution. We had to bring in captioning with an agency that captioned. But when we met with the administration, they thought, well, why can't they just use sign language? And I had to explain, just because they had the same diagnosis doesn't mean they need the same accommodations. So getting and feeling comfortable with asking, because it only benefits the person learning about what to do and how to interact with others. And then, again, education is so important.
Well, thank you. And I know we're going to say a pretty,
You
you
also
know,
have a D and the other one.
what's that? So, especially since we have such an intimate crowd this evening, I would invite those of you who are on mute, if you want to either come off mute and chime in, ask a question, make a comment, or if you want to continue leaving comments, questions in the chats, we can have people from the team read and respond to those as well. Whatever people are most comfortable with, but we want to, make this a more expansive conversation.
If no one's gonna say, can I add one thing that Karen, onto Karen's share? Is that, unless there's somebody who wants to speak, then I'll be quiet.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I love the example that Karen gave, and that was something that I think is really important because when I first learned ASL, I'm really rusty now, but when I first worked with ASL and worked with students in the deaf community, I just assumed everyone in the deaf community had identified as disabled. And it wasn't until I was taking sign language through a school for the deaf and blind that I learned most did not all, but many, at least at the university that I was attending, were not considering themselves as disabled. And they were seeing sign language as a language, because it is a language, right? And did not identify with certain terminology that I identified with. So I thought that was really unique to learn, because from the outside, I was thinking, oh, well, you get accommodations, you're needing this, you must have disability. But for my friends, they didn't consider it to be that way. So I thought that's great that Karen brought that up, because I think like somebody else mentioned in the chat, disability as an identity is a choice, right? And I don't know who said that. I can't remember. I'd have to look back at it. But I agree with that because there was one part of our story where we need accommodations or we need medical care or we need access to medical care. But in schools, we need access to accommodations. And as one who's had to use voice dictation since 93 and note taker since 95, yeah, I'm going to say that was a big part of my issues, right? But I've chosen to identify as disabled, and my choice didn't come initially as that because I was never planning to be a disability advocate. I was planning to work in the civil rights arena, be an advocate for equity and access to legal representation and education. It wasn't until I had to fight for life-saving care that I started realizing I needed to be a spokesperson in the disability community to fight for legal rights and our access to medical care. So I've chosen that as an identity. But a friend of mine who we've worked together at a comedy and creating accessible playgrounds and STEAM programs, he commented to me, he doesn't see me as disabled, but sees me as a person who works alongside my disability. It's not defining me. It's part of me. It's part of who I am. Obviously, you can't miss it, but it's not holding me back either. So I love that comment of choosing to identify, whether identifying it, using it as an identity. Karen's comment of asking, how do you identify yourself? Because we ask that all the time to people now for gender. What are your pronouns, right? Asking somebody what they identify with or as, I think is a great way to break the ice, to learn the situation and to learn somebody's experience. So I love that. And I'm going to be quiet so if anybody else wants to ask questions.
We have a great back and forth going on in the chat between a couple of people with regard to exceptional versus inspiring. Would anyone like to address that?
I'm going to not, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but the folks who put that in there, if I'm just curious where that comes from. I'm not disagreeing with anybody, but, and again, I'm going to ask to make sure I'm pronouncing your first name correctly. Rachna?
Oh, hi. Yeah, my name is Rachna.
Rachna. Okay, thank you. I didn't want to, there I go. I want to ask before I totally mangle it out of respect.
Yeah, you just pronounce it as it's spelled.
Thank you. And then, Zon as well. I mean, you're given back and forth, really highlight how these conversations should happen, because there's no truly right answer. There are definitely wrong ones, but there's no right one per se. It's really should be up to the individual. So if you two, and you're having some great back and forth, like Daniel said, it can share where you're coming from without sharing anything you don't need to share. But I think sharing the why is helpful for those who haven't really thought about this.
What's that?
Kind of sharing the why. So, you wrote down, you get annoyed by disabled because you compare that to like technical terms. My computer's disabled.
Yep.
That might be a generational thing, because I'm going to make an observation that you are a few years younger than some of us in the room, and computers have been part of your world. Ours have not been. And so I can see that being how you can associate that. But some of us look at that as more than just the computer connection. And the terminology, again, is where people use to, and when you talk about disabled from an identity, some people look at that as a badge of courage, as a badge of honor, and others look at saying, you're judging me, and it's negative. So, anyone who's had the chat interactions, again, talking about this, where has this emanated from on your while you've on your journey?
I just had read a speech, since I'm also legally blind. It was called something along the lines of dissing ability. And it is by one of the pioneers in the blindness movement. And ever since I've read that, I hadn't preferred the term disability as much, because some of the terms seem a little shorter and not as clunky, and it just, ever since then, it seemed to have negative connotations for me. Just like I would prefer blind rather than visually impaired. Even if I can see some.
Can you expand on that? Because I think that's also another term, like hearing impaired or hard of hearing are two terms that mean technically the same thing from an audiology perspective, because it's not without hearing like a deaf person or a person who is deaf. It could go back and forth. But why would that be a different preference where other people may say visually impaired works for them?
Well, besides that it's a lot longer, it has the word impaired in it. Probably some are better like challenged, but that's just why isn't as positive, and it seems like a euphemism that you're dodging the who we really are. And that also goes with, we have to educate people that most of us actually can see some. It's more rare if you are totally blind, but that it doesn't need to be bad necessarily. We still have as enriching of lives as anyone else and are as capable. Of course, I'm also representing a nonprofit here by speaking up.
Would you mind sharing a little bit more about that?
So that's the National Federation of Blind, and I'm in the state of Nebraska, so I'm a board member there. So I'm more involved on the local level. That's where I've learned more of a positive philosophy on blindness.
Awesome. And thank you for joining in tonight and for participating in the conversation. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to. I wasn't expecting to actually speak up. I guess I was thinking that just typing in the chat was enough, but I'm glad people were asking about the terms and hadn't heard as much about that.
Well, and we apologize if we put you on the spot, but you made such good comments that, you know, we wanted to give you the opportunity to share more if you wanted to.
Right, yeah, I appreciate that.
Can I ask a question, if you don't mind?
Oh, sure.
Absolutely.
This is Deborah, either way. Just not Debbie. I have a question. So I understand the disabled word and how it can be both ways.
Mhm.
And I don't know how voiceover works with this, or how does it even get translated into I've had a conversation with Daniel about this. Despite being a techie, I have challenges with voiceover. But when I write disabled, I write DIS in lowercase, and I write abled or ability in uppercase. And I don't know if that makes a difference to anybody. I know it makes a difference to me personally, but I have no idea if it makes a difference to anybody else who sees it, except when I wrote a chapter in a collaborative book, originally they thought it was an error, and then they realized I did it everywhere on purpose, and they were, we've never seen that before. That's pretty cool. Well, okay. But I'm curious, does that change the connotation, or does that even come across in voiceover software? Anyway, how does that impact, or does it impact at all, or maybe not anything?
Yeah, I think it's pronounced the same. I'm not sure whether I've seen that or tried that out. Would be interesting. I don't know if anyone else that uses voiceover has.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think it would probably read the same. But I think, you know, for those who are visually seeing the cues, it would probably, you know, like you said, it gets people's attention.
Mhm.
If I may
Zoanne,
jump in
go.
for a second? Yeah, it's Zoanne, you were right. This is my first venture here, and so hi. I am physically disabled as well as I have acute depression. So I kind of jump between the two. I do identify as a member of the disability community. Um, but I also had to take on the persona of disabled when I started graduate school and had to ask for accommodations, which in my master's program I did not get. In my PhD program, fortunately, I am getting, but it is a struggle every term to turn in the same paperwork with the same boxes checked. Insert eye roll here. Yes, no, my disabilities have not changed. Yes, I still need the same accommodations. Gee, it'd be nice if you came up with something new besides extended time for my assignments. Yeah, anybody heard this one before besides me? I'm seeing head nod, Deborah. Thank you. But I was fascinated with the blind, visually impaired. My mother has macular degeneration, and in the last year has lost 90% of her sight. She delights in saying legally blind, not visually impaired. No, she likes legally blind. Thank you very much. And, you know, she's 87 years old. I'm not going to argue with her. She's my mother. But she also has just demonstrated this wonderful ability to tell everyone in the world around her that she is legally blind. And as someone who has more invisible disabilities, and here's my mother out there going, somebody give me a white cane. Okay, mom, wait for Christmas, please.
Or White Cane Safety or White Cane Awareness Day, which is in a couple of months.
Right. She has embraced the disability that I am just now learning to accept after being disabled for 20, never mind how many years, 25 years now. 20, no, longer than that. Okay, brain fog. But I love the give and take of the preferences. That's why I was typing in chat. I fight for words sometimes. It's easier to type for me, but hearing the differences and embracing those differences is, I think, part of why I got more active in the disability community, so that I can see how different people respond and react and speak and use the labels. I am so pleased to have found this group. So thank you.
Well, thank you. And we appreciate you sharing. We appreciate having you here tonight. We hope this isn't the only time you come and be part of our conversation, for sure. And, you know, for all of the rest of you who are new, likewise. Boz, I saw that you put a comment in the chat, and I happen to know you're not shy about sharing your thoughts. So why are you still on mute?
Well, I was giving people the opportunity to participate, and so thought it wise to just input my comment in the chat. But just to complement what I said, and in the event that people didn't get the message, I strive to educate people about my disability. I can tell you historically that in the past, I was very much told by someone, a family member, who was trying to look out for me, and this unequivocally was one of the worst pieces of advice I've received, but if anybody asks whether or not you're blind, say yes, but I'm 10 times smarter than you are. As a child, I actually did that brazenly and was told in no short order, oh yeah, well, I bet you don't know your math. What's 2 times 10? What's 2 times 20? And I couldn't answer those as adequately. I fell silent. And then I thought, you know, that's probably not the best route to go. Through the years, I learned a lot about myself. And I'm still learning about myself. Learning in my mind is a reciprocal exchange whereby events like this allow us to exchange information with each other and really become wise about a variety of topics. And those topics I try to share, not just my disability, but the fact that I love music, I love a good walk, I love reading. And that's why I said in the chat that there's a lot more to somebody than a disability. The language that I use now is simple. I'm blind. And I used to not be like that. I used to hesitate and say visually impaired, couching the term. It really just depends on the perception. And I agree wholeheartedly that it's a good idea to simply ask the person, hey, how would you prefer to be called? And about, or what would you prefer? What language do you prefer as more appropriate? And I can also say too, that the pronunciation of my name, I've been asked that 1,000 times over and people have still botched it. So I empathize and understand that completely. So yeah, just wanted to add my 2 cents. This was it continues to be a great discussion for sure.
I appreciate that, Boz. And, kind of playing off of what you said with that anecdote that you shared, I think back to our discussion about even tonight about exceptionality and differently abled and the pressure that puts on some of us to be exceptional in the way that the world expects, and how unhealthy that can be, to feel like you have to be better, 10 times better than your peers. That's just, it's not a realistic expectation, and it's not really the
Sure.
intent of what we're going for, but it's, I think, the byproduct.
Well, and given the topic that we're addressing, allow me to share just one more anecdote. I promise I'll be brief. The reason I started using blind instead of visually impaired dates back to the time in which I was at school, waiting patiently for my lift to pick me up and take me home. Well, it happened that I was speaking with a driver whose first language was not English. And I kept repeating the fact that he could find me at the door. I'm visually impaired. I'm visually impaired. And he didn't understand it whatsoever. It ended up that the driver canceled on me after hanging up, and I was charged a fee. Subsequent to that, I emailed Lyft explaining exactly what happened, and I was credited. But it was a lesson for me because given that I see light, visually impaired isn't exactly an accurate, precise term. So that's when I started to think, saying blind is not a bad thing and is likely a simpler resolution. So that's what I did.
Single syllable.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right.
Even though I worked a lot with people with visual impairments and blind while in college, now I'm in Clubhouse a lot, probably a little bit too much. And a lot of my friends some are visually impaired, some are blind, right? And I'll ask what terminology somebody wants to identify as with.
Clubhouse is awesome.
Yeah, isn't it? And again, it helps you connect with people with different backgrounds. I mean, my friend Subramani, he is a journalist in India and he is blind, right? And he talks about what it was like to become a journalist being blind in a country where that's not a common experience. But, through these conversations, it helps us understand how people identify, that we do identify with different terminology, and that we'll only know through conversations. We'll only know how somebody best identifies or is most comfortable by asking. Just like you said, you're asked how you pronounce your name. Rashna, we asked you, how do you pronounce your name? Because I would have asked the same thing. I would have seen the CH as a H because of being, now I'm teaching my son Hebrew for his bar mitzvah. So I see CH as a H. But, and that's, again, if I would ask you how to pronounce your name, I don't think, or pronouns or anything else, I don't think it's anything wrong with asking, how do you identify with visual impairment or blind or anything else? So
I
I'm
agree.
glad you brought that up. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I, for one, and I would like to just underscore this because to me, it's so important. I've always espoused the philosophy that the meaning of life is to contribute meaning to others. And by giving meaning to others, they can impart that meaning unto still other people. So in that vein, giving people a modicum of education about disability instills that and enables them to really impart knowledge unto other people, because you never know whom they're going to interact with. I was stopped on campus one time and was asked, hey, how do you use a smartphone? And I was all too happy to show them, because people need that insight. We all need insight in many ways, not just about disabilities. That's why we're constantly learning. That's why we're constantly trying to absorb information from all angles. So I have no qualms whatsoever about my name, my culture, my disability. I'm all too proud to answer those questions because in my mind, simply put, if you don't have those if you don't have those questions answered and you take offense, how is the person supposed to learn otherwise? So I always like to disseminate that learning, if you will.
I've been nodding along. I know you couldn't probably see me nodding, but I just
Nope, but I'm
asking
happy to
you
hear it
for
though.
I'm saying
Yeah,
you
for sure.
probably can't see this.
Oh no, it's all right.
Thank you, though. I think that I'm
Oh, of
also
course.
writing it down to some of the things you shared. I just wanted to say thank you because I think that is so important, which as Daniel
Anytime.
can tell you, I have unique stories from wanting to use my phone with voiceover.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
For
a
sure.
challenge.
for
But
sure.
I have to say, I am inspired by anybody who runs rooms, Clubhouse, Zooms, with anything with voiceover because I am voiceover challenged. So I find that to be inspiring, not because of disabilities, just because I have a challenge with it. But I do want to say thank you. You just dropped like a total gems here. I'm gonna have to play the replay to hear it all back. But I do want to thank everyone who's been sharing tonight. I'm gonna pass it back to Daniel. Sorry, Daniel, you might just automatically taking the mic here.
No, this is going the way it's supposed to go.
Deborah brought up a really good concept that I think also can be part of this conversation. When you acknowledge that I can't see you nodding, there's always a time when, certain phrases are used, and if you use it with someone with a disability, they may not be able to. There's a fear of saying, like, I always tell people, I'll see you later. And, if you are talking to someone who has a visually based disability, I've had people say, but they won't. It's like, it's just a phrase. They're not offended because they said the
100%.
same thing to me
Yes, they do.
on their way out. So I think those kinds of concepts and phrases need to be understood, that unless they are used intentionally for something negative and derogatory, so to speak, they're phrases, and everyone should use what they're comfortable with, because it's not saying, Daniel, I'll talk to you later. Okay, that's fine. Daniel, you won't see me later, but I'll see you later. That's awkward. So
Yeah,
understanding
for sure.
that we can say things to each other, and not necessarily be from a negative or I can't think of the right word. Derogatory is not the right word either.
No, I know.
But say it without offense, and that's the word I was thinking of. That it's part of just the nomenclature of everyone talking at the same point or together, and to talk with someone the same way you would with anybody else is what we're asking for as well.
for sure.
Well, and
Karen?
Karen, I want to pipe in on that too, because I think this is so important. And, Rakshana brought this up earlier. To say that someone who is blind automatically won't see someone or something is actually statistically usually inaccurate. It's not correct to say that I've never seen Karen. I've seen a blur that I've come to know sounds like Karen.
And on some days, Daniel, that's probably better, but
Yet some people do say I hear you in places I see or something.
And just remember,
Like,
there's also
that's
inner
awkward.
vision.
Well, that's true, but I have to say, Karen, I still say I walk the stairs or walk down the block, and then people look at me going, "You walked to school?" And I'm like, no. Like, I literally actually had a doctor write that once. I walked 3 miles in my file because I said walk to school, my son to school, instead of wheel. Meanwhile,
Yeah.
but I also want to point out too how the terminology can be both directions, right? Because I don't care about saying walk or take the stairs, even though I'm not taking the stairs. I mean, when somebody looks at me when I say take the stairs, they kind of like take 3 or 4 head turns at me. But when somebody can't do something and they can't find something, then they say, "What, you think I'm blind or something?" Right? Then that's where we're talking about like that negative connotation.
correct.
And that's where that distinction is in my mind. That
Yes.
a commonality of just a common phrase like the word Xerox, right? Because it's so common used, it becomes that common term and no longer is protected. Sorry, going to the trademarking, but that loss of protection of that word. It's the same kind of thing I feel like when we're saying see you later or go for a walk. It's the same concept of verbiage that is commonly used, and it has become a very basic understanding, right? Universal understanding of a word. And as long as we're not using it in a negative connotation, I think that makes that big difference, right? Because I will correct my children if they say, "What, you think I'm blind or something?" when they can't find something, because that's not appropriate, right? Now, and this is also me who loses everything because of my brain fog all the time. So, that's a different story. But I just wanted to point that out because when it's used in my mind in a commonality of a word that people just are generally understanding what that means versus something that has a negative connotation, it was designed to put somebody down, right? And I think that has a different impact. This is my personal view of that, but that's how I feel when I hear verbiage such as that.
Yeah, I think both of you explained it very well. I mean, I've struggled with that. Like composing an email with an attachment, I always say, "Please see the attachment." But when I'm communicating with somebody who's blind, I think I changed the language. And yeah.
And I think the point that Deborah brought up about, saying something that it really is not intended to be nasty or intended to be derogatory is one thing. But using, like you said, "What do you think, I'm blind?" That when that's used that way, it is not intended to be nasty to the person you're talking to, but it has a nasty negative connotation because it's like you're less than. You don't think I can do it because I don't have vision? No, I don't think you can find it because you haven't moved anything to look around. And it's the same thing. For years, there was something called the R word campaign, where we really tried our best to distinguish the use of retard because it was not used. It should never have been a word, but it was used as a derogatory term. And so even though it's a musical term, it's not, no one knows that unless they know music. So it's the same thing. There are ways you can just be as natural, see you later, see attached. Because it's not meant to say, "I can't," they can't. But then to use it the other way, that's what we have to address as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with Karen. From my purview, if someone says, "Please see attached," to me, that's utterly normal. I don't even think about, "Oh, they mean see, I have to see, I'm offended." To me, because it's just the commonplace language that we use all the time, I just don't take umbrage to it. I don't take any kind of offense. It's not anathema to me whatsoever. So I just open the attachment and go on my merry way. But yeah, if somebody said, "What are you, blind?" I do find that a little more offensive for sure, because it is negative, and that negativity, again, is something that I always try to dispel. So it goes against my philosophical grain and something that I don't like. But see you tomorrow, see you later. Have you watched the show? Have you watched that? To me, it's just, I use that. I do all the time. It just has another significance to me.
So you don't say listening to, I'm just curious. But Buzz, okay, you're gonna have to help me for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
You got it.
I'm a little challenged too for that. So that was one of the things I've also learned on Clubhouse of the listening to movies, right? Several of my friends would post in rooms and the descriptive videos, movies, what have you call them, had a full description of everything happening in the video, which I thought was pretty cool. And it was a different way of listening to the sound of music. And
Yep.
I'm just curious, do you say listening or you just say watching?
Nope, I say watching.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I say watching because, again,
You do watch it.
it's just common. It's just used, and I've adopted it into my own language. So yeah, have you watched this movie? Have you watched that movie? And I guess if you really want to be technical, the descriptions allow you the ability to watch within the depths of your imagination. They paint a picture, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's what I was gonna
I
ask,
don't-
because in my mind, I did see the whole picture, kind of more descriptive than a book. So, yes.
Yeah.
If anyone
Hey,
else
no,
does
I
it,
don't mind
it's
that at all.
interesting.
Boz, to that point, not to belabor this much more, but to that point, do you find that when people really start to shy away from the visual language, that actually seems to widen the chasm and deepen the
Yes.
stigma rather than addressing it?
Yes, it really does. Yeah, I think you and I mean, I'm assuming you have the same kind of thought process, but it does because, again, it's not standardized. I don't like listening to a movie, though I respect anybody who says that in deference to my disability. That I understand and I fully respect, but they don't have to. You know, you don't have to. Have you watched this movie? Have I watched this movie? I'm completely okay with that kind of language. And you're absolutely right. I mean, to me, or at least to your question, yeah, it does definitely widen the chasm.
So, if I'm understanding the characteristics of the room correctly, we have a bunch of people who self-identify in the room in Fred. And so I think this is a great opportunity amongst a group of us. How can we, as individuals who want to carve out a better destiny for ourselves and others, what can we do to empower our allies who, as Fred mentioned, is, he and many others were trying to do the right thing and they're not getting a direct message? What can we do to address that?
Well, what I would say is answer questions. Answer as many questions and let them know, being as direct as you can. Hey, if you have any questions, and I've done this before, hey, if you have any questions about my disability or just want to ask, please feel free. I'm not going to get offended. Of course, it depends on the situation you're in, but if you have that opportunity, don't hesitate. Because again, at least in my view, more awareness means more of a broader, better perception.
Karen, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, I totally agree with that. And education is key, and people can't learn if they don't get questions. They don't ask questions, they don't get questions asked. And I would tell people, it's okay to make a mistake, or to feel like Fred explained, I don't know what to do. And you learn from that, because that's how you move forward. I always tell people, I distinguish the difference between naivety and ignorance, where I think naivety is you haven't learned it yet and you're willing to understand something. Ignorance is when you've chosen to ignore what's in front of you. And so when people continue to use certain terminology that we've said to them, that's really not appropriate, and they continue to do it, but they probably know it's not correct, that's ignorance. But someone goes, oh, okay, it's like the pronoun. That's really a more recent thing that we've started recognizing. People have different pronouns they identify with. And it's okay if you realize I misgendered you. It's temporary because I'm learning. Where if someone continues to do it, regardless of what they really are doing damage to that particular person, and they continue, that's where it becomes negative. So I think asking questions, being not afraid to say, I made a mistake, help me correct that. Let me learn more about your experiences so I can help myself. And then basically it's like, and then help someone else. So I think there's a lot of room, but the conversation needs to happen and needs to continue. And we need to do it probably like this place, in safe spaces where there is no judgment, because it's a matter of, I appreciate your asking. Let me help you learn that.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks.
I wanted to add on to what they were saying too. I work with kids all the time and going into the classrooms, well, at least pre-COVID, going into the classrooms and working with the youth to be open and upfront, not only about my disabilities, but especially out here I was in the Bay Area, working a lot with children on the spectrum. I go in to talk to the children on and about different types of disabilities, visible and invisible, become somebody they can ask questions to, but also talk about how do we create these inclusive spaces for people of all abilities. And as a Scout leader, I do the same thing, which I was just doing the other night. But I think it's also important that we get the opportunity to speak with businesses. And I know Dana and I have talked about this before too, with the consulting with businesses, with chambers of commerces, with local government, to teach people on the right verbiage and the way to communicate with each other. And I'll just give a quick antidote. I did just serve as Miss Wheelchair California USA. And I did this role this past year because I wanted to help create a better narrative for young people coming of age that have different types of disabilities, because I know how I felt lesser than for most of my life. And when I met with our local mayor to get working on a proclamation for one of my disorders, she actually was very upfront. And even though she's worked on the Orphan Drug Act and other things herself, she said she didn't know all of the right verbiage or ways to address, or even how to ask the questions of communication. And if that's somebody who doesn't know, but she was open to asking me, but she didn't know, that means we have more, I don't want to say more work to do, it's not technically our responsibility, but it is our, as a community, it'd be very helpful if we find ways to be able to address adults as well as youth about these different elements and experiences and knowledge, and even just the ability to learn how to ask us so that we can find that common ground, I think is really important. And I find it's harder to get into businesses versus the classrooms. And I also find that children are way more open to asking, especially the younger children, especially most of the time, the little kids will ask me all the time anyway, and parents will freak out. So I think the more we normalize these conversations is valuable. And Sandy's been putting some great comments in the chat and some really important things too, which also reminded me when I did my master's program in higher ed, it was education focused in higher ed, recruitment and retention of minority people in higher education. They had nothing on people with disabilities. And in fact, it was actually one of the worst programs to be in for people with disabilities. And the #1 program at that university at the time that was the worst was people for special education, which shocked me, both of those programs being listed as ones not to take because of the interactions that students were having with these schools and these programs. We need to create spaces for the discussion in the businesses and in the youth programs for children, but we also need to make sure it's being included as part of programs for minority education, diversity, inclusion, DEI, and that these DEI trainings that people have and businesses have include incorporation of people with disabilities, visible and invisible, my opinion, but that is, with that, I will yield the mic.
Well, thank you. And I want to, address even seems like the wrong word. I wanted to speak to Sandy's comment too about the, that line of trying to make inclusive language more of the standard rather than trying to conform to ableist language. I think it's a valid point. I think Fred mentioned earlier, find attachment versus see attached. That seems like a natural turn of phrase and may even be more accurate as far as the verbiage goes. I'm struggling though to find the right replacement words for, walking down the street, as Deborah mentioned, or, watching a movie. I suppose even viewing a movie would still be ableist citizens. So, Sandy or anyone else, if you have thoughts for going down the street could work.
By the way.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's, if you have no.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, enjoying the movie. I mean, and I'm not saying this to be snarky, but just in real response, what if we didn't actually enjoy the movie?
I have a question, Daniel. But
yes.
aren't you still watching it in your mind? Because the description, at least the ones that I've heard, right, have been so visual, right, to the detail of someone's at the door and knocking on the door, or a man has come up the walkway and is about to knock on the door, and then you hear the knock on the door, right? And to my mind, it was very visual. And I know that Behzad was saying this earlier too, is you can see things in your mind's eye. And maybe because I do my meditation, I do mindfulness work, maybe I see it more than somebody else might, I don't know. But I found the descriptions to be so detailed that it was like watching a movie just in my brain. I don't know if that's what happens for you or not, but that's what happens.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, where I'm trying to go with this is it's a delicate balance, because I respect and appreciate what, the points that Sandy's bringing up, other people in the social justice movement are bringing up, trying to really reframe our lexicon. And I think it's good and valuable work. But I know I'm not alone in my, and I think, as a blind man myself, I know I've run into that myself with others of, why would I go to a movie? And that's a real concern. At the same time, I'm also concerned by, again, is our attempt to elevate the English language, is it decreasing or increasing stigma? And I think there are moments where there's a palpable feeling of this person just caught themselves saying something that they weren't sure about, and you can tell in the air that they became less comfortable with me and my presence. And that worries me. And it's not all about the policing language. There's a lot more to it, but I think it's a real concern, at least in my mind, nonetheless. But I think
you have
there's
good points, Daniel, and so did Sandy, and Fred, and I will be honest, I am working towards saying more of wheeling down the street or going down the street, using more appropriate, more, not appropriate verbiage, but more, less ableist, more, I don't know the right term to express it, but more along the lines of the actuality, the actual language of what I'm doing, descriptive language of what I'm doing. And especially after having a doctor write in my medical file that I walked 3 miles. I just haven't walked even half a mile in 40 years. So I don't know what he was thinking, but it was because of the verbiage used at the appointment. And it has made me all the more aware now of using verbiage that is more aligned with what I'm actually doing, not versus what is common language. And I hear you, right? Because just because it's been in the English language and is a description that's been used for a long time doesn't make it right. It just makes it common, but not right. As even we've seen in the Black Lives Matters movement. And last night in our workshop, we were working with the youth. We were giving the example of the Aunt Jemima change in the pancake mix and that kind of element. And it's just because it's been in existence doesn't make it right. So I do agree with taking time to take note and see what is more appropriate for language versions of language representing different things in our community. Thank you. And I saw Fred, you have my unmuted.
I think it's a great point, and we're coming up to the end here. So I want to maybe open it up for everyone to share a closing thought or two, and then we can go ahead and wrap up.
Fred was unmuted before. I'm going to put you on the spot. We're going to add something before?
I'm sorry, me?
Yeah.
No, I was gonna just chime in a little bit. I forgot what I was gonna say though, but it doesn't matter. But as far as a closing thought, I mean, well, as always, I've learned a tremendous amount, and yeah, I mean, I think some of the great advice about if the opportunity's there to, if I'm not sure, to ask, right, and not to be so overly concerned about using the wrong term, as long as it's terminology that is, this sort of accepted terminology, accepted parlance, as in the manner we speak. So that's, very helpful, I find.
Hi, this is Christy.
Go ahead, Christy.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, Christy.
Hi. I was just gonna say, first and foremost, thank you everyone who came tonight, and I really appreciate each and every one of you being open and honest and vulnerable. It really was a great conversation, and I think that there needs to be a lot more of these going on so that everyone can see the different perspectives. And it was truly enlightening this evening, and I did learn a lot from each and every one of you. So thank you.
I'm going to tag into both what Fred and Christy said. Don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to even share that you are afraid to ask, because we're all going to say something at one point in our lives, whether we have a diagnosis, we live or not, that might upset or offend somebody. That's how life works. But recognizing that that's going to happen and giving yourself grace, that's a phrase I've been using more often this past couple of years, is really helpful for everybody to know we're always learning, because this is an ongoing, fluid, developing way of working with people. And I guarantee in 20, 30 years, it's going to change again as we learn more about ourselves and about everything else. But ask questions. Be a part of the conversation, and know that your input as Fred said, this is really a new conversation for him in many ways because of his background doesn't line up with some of ours. Understanding that you still have something to share based on your own experiences is just as important as those of us who have lived with diagnosis or have family members we've supported with that. It's just, we're all need a part, it's a community. And I know that the proverbial phrase, it takes a village, we are the village. And that's how we can help each other.
I loved everything that was shared in the conversation tonight. The only other thing I was going to add to that is, I don't want to say it's our responsibility, but I will say by speaking out more and more and doing programs like this, which I'm just sort of just getting comfortable with, live events on YouTube or Facebook and other things, it helps share our message. And I was just actually starting to type this in the chat. I have a very unique, sarcastic, silly, goofy humor that my whole family seems to have. And I'm feeling really bad for the interpreter putting all those words together. But I will say, though, when I've been on interviews and I'm laughing about all the craziness that goes on with my body, it makes it easier for the person listening because they are more comfortable knowing it's okay. I'm okay, and it's the way of my coping, but it also allows them to hear what I'm saying in a different way. And apparently it's resonating with them too. So the thing I would also impart is, I don't want anybody to feel obligated to be an educator or to go and use any experience as a teachable moment. But I will say, if you have that time, the energy of the moment to teach somebody when they're showing interest, take advantage of it because you never know whose life you're going to impact. I'll just leave you with the one. I was taking photos of sunflowers at a pumpkin patch, and all the kids walking by kept on seeing my dog, and I can tell everybody wanted to know what my service dog did. So finally I just stopped the whole class, had them put their hand on their head, and I kind of forgot to tell them to put their hand down during the entire time I was talking about my dog did. I kind of realized that afterwards. But I took that moment to educate these first and second graders what my service dog does. What is a service dog for a mobility service dog? What do they do? And what he happens to do for me, because he pulls me, brace, picks up things for me, and he's medical alert for me because he knows when I'm going to pass out way before I do. And yes, I still try to argue with my dog, telling him I'm okay, which doesn't really work because apparently he knows better than I do. But it's that reality of being open to educating people, being open to speaking, being open to learning, because there's a lot that all of us don't know. So being open to being educated as well, I think, is also incredibly valuable. And like Karen said, grace. I think grace for ourselves as we learn, and grace for others as they learn, and just grace for each other in terms of community and learning that we're going to have different opinions. We're coming from different experiences. Our viewpoints might be different, but it doesn't mean we can't have a conversation and a respectful dialogue with each other. So thank you so much, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you. And yeah, I completely agree. You know, this is where the rubber meets the road. And you know, returning back to a comment that was made in the chat, you know, we don't want to normalize, we don't want to stop pushing forward. And yes, that does require all of us getting outside of our comfort zones. You know, we hope that our allies get a little better at, you know, removing a word here and, you know, replacing it with a more empowered and enlightened thought there. And we hope that more people who are on the fence will come over to become allies. And it's also true that as advocates, we don't have the responsibility to educate, but we do have the opportunity. I think for any of us who have studied the long and tragic history of ableism and depression over the years and centuries, it's hard to comprehend that and not take a moment and reflect and say, wow, we're blessed to be in this time where there is still a tremendous amount of work to be done, but we have the opportunity to be heard and for our message to be presented in various forms and fashions in a way that resonates more than arguably it ever has in human history. That's an opportunity, and it's something that I anticipate will continue to grow exponentially. And so for me, and for many people on this call, as we have chosen the life of an advocate, it's an exciting time. Yeah, there's a lot to be done. Yeah, we want people to get better. We want to get better ourselves. But I think all of those things and many more are true. So with that, I want to thank everyone who came tonight, participated. We had an awesome conversation. As always, I want to thank our interpreters for, being here, sharing of their talents. And for anyone who is curious, we recommend Interpreter Now. We, get in contact if you want to know more about them. They have been a tremendous partner of ours. And so thanks again, and we will be with you again in September.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.